What you know, alibis? Welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. It's Saturday, February 15th. Hope you guys are having a good weekend so far. I spent part of the day watching the preliminary hearing for Kendall Mims and Victoria Tippett. They are charged with accessory after the fact, obstruction of justice, and concealing the commission of a felony in the death of Jessica Barnes. Jessica's husband, Brandon, also behind bars, but waived his right to a preliminary hearing. I've got some backstory episodes on this case. So if you're not familiar, I'm going to link that playlist in the description. Just a quick rundown. The three women lived with Brandon in a pool house that was owned by Kendall's grandfather on the same property, just separate from that main house. Brandon and Kendall had a child together, but when Jessica and Brandon met and Jessica moved in, Brandon said that Kendall was his sister and the child was his niece. Eventually, Jessica learned the truth, but Jessica and Brandon also got pregnant. She lost the baby. There's been a lot of talk from people that knew Jessica that perhaps she had been beaten and lost the baby. However, Brandon was never charged with that. Victoria was only in the house a few weeks before the murder, still caught in the middle of this horrific story. So, the preliminary hearing was yesterday, February 14th, in Anderson County, South Carolina. I would have gone, but I'm sitting in the Rose Petal murder trial here in Greenville. But this was live streamed by Court TV, and I was able to catch up on it today. The only witness called for this preliminary hearing is Officer Steve Westcott with the Pendleton Police Department. He was the lead investigator on the case. He explains how he established probable cause and just a little bit of a backstory, so some of this makes more sense when we get there. On July 31st of last year, police were called to Jessica's mother's house. Jessica was having a mental health episode, threatened to harm herself, and was transported to the hospital. She checked herself out, and on August 1st or 2nd is when Jessica was killed. September 10th, Jessica's mom goes in to report her daughter as missing. So they responded to the house that Jessica was living in and made contact with Brandon Barnes, Victoria Tippett, and Kendall Mims in that pool house on the property. Victoria told law enforcement she was the last person to see Jessica, and that was on July 31st. She saw Jessica go into the pool house, and Victoria also went inside. Victoria said she was holding Kendall and Brandon's baby. Victoria asked Jessica what she was doing, and Jessica said she was packing some belongings and going to Michigan, but didn't elaborate any further. Victoria said Jessica left, and that was the last time she saw her. Law enforcement also talked to Kendall and Brandon. Brandon said that Jessica had left in the past for extended amounts of time, so he wasn't worried about her being gone, and the witness said that Kendall had very little to say. Law enforcement took written statements, and the investigation continued over the following days. Now, Kendall Mims' grandfather, who owns that property where they all stayed, told law enforcement he had put tracking devices on the car registered to Brandon, as well as one of his own cars that was being driven by his granddaughter, Kendall. He put those trackers on there because he was the lien holder on the cars and had a financial interest. There were also some issues with Brandon's previous relationship, and the grandfather didn't feel safe with him being with Kendall. They found Jessica's body from those trackers on the cars. They found that Brandon's car had made multiple trips from the home to Twin Lakes Drive in Pickens County, South Carolina, right by Lake Hartwell, a really popular big lake here in the upstate. There was a path there that led to a quarry, and law enforcement found there were multiple trips for extended periods of time beginning August 1st up to August the 5th. The car would be in that area anywhere from 30 minutes to over 2 hours at a time, and then the car would return back to that residence and then go back to Twin Lakes. There was no activity on Jessica's cell phone or social media, and her mom hadn't heard from her in over a month. Law enforcement put together a plan to go search this location and use a cadaver dog, and they went there on September 19th. They had multiple search teams in different locations. An officer from Clemson University found a location off the trail about a quarter of a mile from the parking area and found that something had been burned. This is the parking area where Brandon's car had been several times. The witness was with the cadaver dog, so they went to that area and the dog indicated human remains. From there, they called the coroner from Pickens County, who indicated that it seemed to be human remains. They also called in an anthropologist from Clemson University who came on scene, searched through that burn pile, and verified those were human remains. They secured the scene, and this was later in the afternoon. Pickens County stayed on the scene, and then SLED came out the next day. That's the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division here in South Carolina. They found teeth and a jawbone in the burn pile, and ultimately, Jessica was identified by dental records. There were very limited remains due to thermal damage, and there was an interview with Brandon, Kendall, and Victoria on October 1st. Victoria told law enforcement there was a 5-gallon bucket at the home where they were staying, which had some of Jessica's remains in it. The three were arrested, and law enforcement got a search warrant. After they were arrested, they all confessed to what happened. The witness said there had been previous interviews with them, and they had ample opportunity to tell law enforcement what happened, but they did not until they were arrested on October 1st. Jessica was choked to death in the pool house by Brandon. Victoria and the baby were both there when it happened. Kendall was at work, but Kendall did learn of the murder when she came home. Jessica's remains had already been placed inside of a large Rubbermaid tote, which Brandon and Victoria bought using Kendall's debit card at a Walmart. The purchase was after the murder, and an officer with SLED found surveillance video at that Walmart of the two of them walking out of the store with the tote as well as a shovel. When Kendall came home from work, Brandon and Victoria told her that he killed Jessica. Kendall's grandfather has a Ring camera, and you can see the tote being brought out of the pool house by all three. They put it in Brandon's car, and they told law enforcement that they drove around searching for a location to dispose of the remains, and they ended up on Twin Lakes Road. The tracking device showed the drive, and also their confessions confirmed that. They said they did look at a place in Georgia and determined it just wasn't a good location. Brandon said the Twin Lakes location was the first place he and Jessica went on a date, and it had sentimental value. They did try to dig using the shovel they bought, but they could not get through the hard dirt. That's when they decided to burn her remains. They made several trips out there, and in that time frame, law enforcement has text messages between Kendall and Victoria where Kendall was keeping a watch on the roadway while Brandon and Victoria were burning Jessica's body. The witness said they were at the burn site approximately 10 times between the murder and when her remains were found. SLED got involved around September 14th after Kendall's grandfather told them about the tracker he put on the cars. The night of the incident, Kendall is seen on Ring camera carrying gas cans, and SLED did determine an accelerant was used when her body was burned. They found cut trees were placed over the burn site, and then found that Grandpa has a battery-operated saw, which is seen being taken from the garage and then brought back. The bucket that they put her remains in, as well as a 50-pound bag of cement, was bought at a Lowe's, and all three of them were there when the purchase was made. The remains were put into a different bucket than the one they purchased at some point. In their interviews, they admitted to what was in the bucket, and law enforcement would not have found that had the three of them not told them about it. It was away from the house and under some overgrowth on the property. Kendall's grandfather was very instrumental in helping solve this murder. He called law enforcement and said the tracker on the car showed that on September 14th or 15th, the three of them were in Tennessee. They then drove through West Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and ended up staying in Colorado. Kendall and her grandfather have a joint bank account. He could see they booked a room in Colorado for 2 days, but they checked out after the first day and came back to Pendleton. They said they went to Tennessee for vacation, and from there went to Colorado because of the pressure on social media as well as law enforcement questioning them. When law enforcement saw that they were close to being back in South Carolina, SLED put a trail camera up at the burn site. And after returning home, one of the first things they did was go back to that burn site. The tracker also shows this trip. They get out of the car, and all three are seen looking at where the burn site had been. There was no blood found at the site of the murder, but Victoria told law enforcement that her and Brandon went to Food Lion to buy bleach and some more cleaning products because fluid came out of Jessica's mouth and they used the products to clean that small spot. Law enforcement spoke to the three multiple times after the murder up to their arrest, and they did lie until that last time when they were arrested. While Jessica was missing, the three of them did things in the community to make it look like they were looking for Jessica. The witness was transferred a call where Brandon asked if he could get a copy of the missing person flyer. He was told he could print that off the website. They all met with Troy from Blunt Force Media in the town square and gave an interview. Brandon actually left and came back and was carrying the ashes of the baby Jessica lost. That was it on direct from the prosecution. On cross, Kendall's attorney: you said the missing persons report was filed by Jessica's mom on September 10th, and there was nothing from anyone else before that date. No. You went to the residence and spoke to all three parties. Did you speak to them alone or together? The witness said when they initially made contact, all three were together in the house, but they did separate Victoria and took her outside while Kendall and Brandon talked inside the residence. After you spoke to them, did you run a background check on them? He said no. At that point, all they had was a missing persons case. He's asked if law enforcement had ever been called to the residence prior to the missing person case. The witness said in October of 2023, he responded to the residence for an incident while another officer was at a different location talking to Jessica's mom. His body cam showed Brandon, Jessica, and Kendall at that residence, but he doesn't remember exactly what he was called out there for. When he looked up information about Brandon, he found there were incidents of domestic violence and that Brandon had been arrested in Maine and also had a juvenile record for something along those lines. But nothing with Jessica, Kendall, or Victoria, and they never had any calls about domestic violence at that residence. They did learn during the course of the investigation that Jessica had a stillborn baby, and the Anderson County Sheriff's Office did investigate that and made a report, which the witness has. The defense mentions in that report, it says they noticed bruising all over Jessica's body, and another officer noted Jessica had a black eye, but the witness said they never received any reports of domestic violence. He's asked if they did triangulation of the three cell phones during the missing persons investigation. That is looking at location data through cell phone towers. He said they did not do that, but through search warrants, they did get data from their phones. She asks if he got a search warrant for the forensics on the phones. Somebody did, but it was not him personally. Brandon's victim from the domestic violence in Maine called law enforcement and expressed concerns about strangulation. The defense asks if he spoke to Kendall alone during the course of the investigation, and the witness said no, they were always together, and mentions that Brandon is a very controlling individual. The minor child was typically being watched by Kendall's grandfather when Kendall was being questioned. The witness said Kendall's grandfather was very helpful in solving the case, and the defense asks if they got a search warrant for those trackers he had put on the cars. The witness said he believes SLED did. If not the warrant, her grandpa gave permission verbally and also in writing. He's asked how many times he's worked domestic violence cases. He says he could not even count. He's also had training on domestic violence issues. When asked if he was concerned about domestic violence in the house, he said they had just never gotten calls to respond to that address. They did, however, get calls from Jessica's mom. She told them of an incident in November of 2023 where she thought Jessica had been a victim of domestic violence, but Anderson County Sheriff's Office responded to that incident and not Pendleton Police. So the attorney asked why Pendleton wasn't notified. And the witness said because Pendleton is off duty starting at 2 a.m. on Saturday morning until 8 a.m. on Monday. So if anything happens during that time frame, it's the Anderson County Sheriff's Office that would respond. By the way, Pendleton, South Carolina, very tiny town. I think there's maybe 4,000 or less residents. On July 31st, we talked about this at the very beginning of the episode. Jessica was taken to the hospital by EMS for a mental health evaluation. On the drive to the hospital, she had her phone and was texting Brandon. She checked herself out and left the hospital and was seen walking around town, still talking to Brandon on the phone. On October 1st, Brandon drove to Anderson to get Jessica and brought her back to the pool house they were living in. The witness did not speak to Kendall's parents during the course of the investigation, but the defense asks if he's aware her parents sought help from law enforcement in North Carolina and Georgia trying to find her. The witness knew about North Carolina and Georgia and said that that's one reason her grandfather put the tracker on the car, because at one point, Kendall and Brandon went to Georgia and the family had no contact with her. So when they came back, he put the tracker on the car so everybody would know where she was at all times. They were very worried about Brandon, and rightfully so. Did Jessica's mom make you aware she suspected Brandon was acting as Jessica when texting after Jessica went missing? The witness said yes. The reason her mom reported her missing is because she had not heard from Jessica on her birthday, and mom got a text from Jessica's phone, but did not think it was Jessica who sent it. It wasn't the way she wrote her text messages. There were long run-on sentences, and her son had also received a similar text from Jessica's phone. Law enforcement responded. They read both text messages and agreed they seemed very similar. One thing, Jessica used a lot of emojis in her texts, but these texts had none. The witness also said Brandon would use all three of the girls' phones and their social media. The defense asks when Brandon and Victoria went to Walmart to buy the tote and the shovel, they used Kendall's debit card, and just points out Kendall was at work and not with them, and that's correct. He's asked if Brandon was funneling large amounts of money from Kendall's account to his own. The witness said it seemed like Kendall would get paid and then transfers were made from her account into Brandon's. Jessica had very little money and they didn't see anything coming from Victoria's account into Brandon's. Kendall, by the way, was working two different jobs. Kendall's attorney asked the witness, "Are you aware one of her coworkers made a statement about injuries she constantly saw on Kendall?" And the witness says yes. "Were you aware Brandon made Kendall either wear a headset or keep her phone on at all times when she wasn't with him so he could listen to everything she did?" The witness said he found out while Brandon was at work, he was constantly on the phone with all the parties, and when Kendall was at work, she was on the phone as well. The defense says the witness testified that Kendall rarely spoke at all. The witness says yes. The only time he saw emotion from her was back in October of 2023 when they were called out and he made contact with her, Jessica, and Brandon. They asked who had the relationship first with Brandon, and that was Kendall. He's not sure when it started. Jessica was introduced into this equation near the end of 2023, and Victoria was in the picture in July, just a few weeks before Jessica was murdered. Kendall was not there when the murder happened. And the defense says you said in her interview, she gave you information about what had happened. The witness said he was not there for that interview, but he did watch a video of it. And she initially stated Jessica had left on her own. Nobody knew where she was, but eventually told us what she had been told, which is Jessica had taken her own life. He's asked, Kendall never said she knew Jessica was murdered. And the witness said no. She was telling us what she was told, which is Jessica disappeared and took her own life. Now, Brandon and Kendall got a marriage license but never got married. The defense asked if he found the child Brandon and Kendall had was a secret. He said no. They asked, did you know Jessica was present when Kendall gave birth? And again, he said no. Did you uncover any plot to kill Jessica? Anything indicated Kendall wanted to do this or planned to do this? The witness said nothing showed there was a plan to kill Jessica. They found text messages that Kendall and Jessica didn't get along, but the witness said that's something he expected. And her attorney says, I place that blame squarely on Brandon. Victoria's attorney was up next to question the witness and asks about that July 31st disturbance. The witness said when he and another officer showed up, Jessica was laying in the street and had all of her belongings, and it was at the residence next door to her mother's house. Brandon and Jessica were placed on a trespass notice at her mom's house where Jessica's siblings also lived. Brandon was there while they were on scene and waiting for EMS to arrive to get Jessica. Kendall came and stayed separate from where Jessica and Brandon were. The defense asks what the disturbance was, and the witness said Brandon had brought Jessica back to the residence with all of her belongings, and initially his intention was leaving her there. Then he wanted to bring her with him, and Jessica threatened to hurt herself. That was captured on body cam. The defense asks about the contact he had with the three when they made written statements and asks if that was on body cam. Yes, and it was turned over to the solicitor. Kendall's grandfather described Brandon as manipulative and narcissistic with women, and the witness said, and if his lips are moving, he's lying. Jessica's mom told investigators that Brandon was abusive and provided law enforcement with a photo of Jessica with a black eye. The defense asks about another woman who dated Brandon for 2 to 3 months who said he put a cigarette out on her leg, but she didn't report the incident. He had heard that story. You said you got to the Twin Lakes location from the car tracker, but in your report, you said a confidential source said that Brandon had been at Twin Lakes August 3rd. Was there a confidential source? The witness says yes, and it was Kendall's grandfather. Aside from the dental records identifying Jessica, was there any DNA done? The witness said SLED did do DNA identification of Jessica. He's asked if there were any large bones found at the burn site. He said not to his knowledge. There were no areas in the pool house where bleach had been used. In follow-up by the prosecution, July 31st is that civil incident when EMS was called. Then Jessica was seen on August 1st wandering around downtown, and that's also the date Brandon picked her up. That same day, Jessica and Brandon returned to the pool house, which was captured on Kendall's grandfather's ring cam. The next day, August 2nd, Kendall leaves for work and Jessica is alive. When Kendall comes home, she sees Jessica's body in that plastic bin. Kendall said she never knew Brandon choked Jessica to death, but in her interview, she did admit Brandon told her what happened. They asked, what did Kendall say in the end that Brandon told her? The witness said he was trying to restrain her with his arm around her neck in a WWE move, and he choked her. Victoria demonstrated in her interview how Brandon held Jessica because she saw it happen. He's asked if he collected the physical trackers. No. Grandfather still has them as far as he knows, but they did extract the data. Kendall mentioned that the house smelled of bleach, but Brandon told her he bombed the house for bugs. Kendall's attorney asks if he remembers Kendall saying over and over that Jessica was still moving when Brandon left the room. The witness said he was not in that interview and Kendall wasn't there when the murder happened. That was it for the questioning of this witness. Kendall's attorney did ask the judge to drop the accessory after the fact charges because the only evidence they have she knew it was a murder was based on her saying she knew he restrained her but thought Jessica was still alive after the restraining was over. And to be guilty of accessory after the fact of murder, she would have to know a murder occurred. The state says, when you come home from work and there's a dead person inside of a tote and you tell law enforcement that the person demonstrated how the choking occurred, it defies logic. You don't know a felony and a murder has occurred. The judge found probable cause for all 3 charges. That was everything that happened in that preliminary yesterday. Keep you guys updated if we hear of any new hearings, any plea deals, or anything else happening in the case. But that's it for now. Hope you guys have a good rest of your evening. We will see you soon.